Rain poured heavily that night, blanketing the small town in sheets of silver. Streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, and the sidewalks had become narrow streams of water. Daniel Cruz walked steadily, his work shirt soaked through, his boots squelching with every step. At 42 years old, Daniel had grown used to nights like this. Being a mechanic at a small garage didn't give him luxury or comfort, but it gave him enough to keep the rent paid and food on the table for his daughter Maria. He never complained, because Maria was the reason he endured everything. His shift had ended later than usual. A customer had come in right before closing, desperate for his car to be fixed in time for work the next morning. Daniel stayed behind, wiping oil from his hands, tightening bolts, doing what he did best. By the time he locked up, the buses had already stopped running. Without a car of his own, there was no choice but to walk the 4 miles back home. He carried no umbrella, only the stubborn hope that he could make it through the storm quickly. Cars whizzed past him, spraying water across the curb, and Daniel hugged the edge of the road, shoulders hunched against the rain. Each splash of cold reminded him how invisible people like him were to the rest of the world. Mechanics, janitors, waitresses. No one paid them any mind until something broke. Until then, they were shadows, unnoticed, unimportant. Halfway through his walk, headlights flared behind him. Daniel instinctively stepped closer to the curb, but instead of keeping distance, the car, a sleek black luxury sedan, deliberately veered toward the edge. Tires cut through a deep puddle, sending a wave of muddy water straight over him. He gasped as the cold drenched him from head to toe. The tinted window slid down, revealing a man in his 50s wearing an immaculate suit, his gold watch gleaming even in the dim light. The man smirked as if the scene were comedy, not cruelty. "Get out of the road, loser," he shouted, his voice dripping with mockery before stepping on the gas. The sedan roared off into the distance, its red taillights fatting into the rain. Daniel stood frozen, fists clenched, humiliation burning hotter than the cold. He could have shouted back, could have cursed the man, but what would it change? Nothing. He exhaled slowly, forcing the anger down. Fighting the world wouldn't get him home. Maria was waiting, and she deserved a father who carried hope, not bitterness. With heavy boots, he started walking again. The man in the car was Richard Hale, the CEO of Hale Financial. Richard had once been poor himself, but poverty had not humbled him. It had hardened him. As a boy, he had been teased for hand-me-down clothes, for showing up at school with worn shoes, for smelling like the factory where his father worked. He had sworn to himself that one day he would rise above it all, that he would never be insignificant again. Over the years, he built his empire ruthlessly, clawing his way to wealth. With each success, his arrogance grew. To him, power meant stepping on others before they could step on him. Seeing Daniel trudging along that night had reminded Richard of the weakness he despised. Splashing him hadn't been an accident. It had been Richard's way of proving to himself that he was above that life, above people like that. He drove off without a second thought, satisfied with the sting of superiority. But life has a way of remembering. A week later, under clear summer skies, Richard set out for a countryside estate where he was meeting investors. It was supposed to be a weekend of fine dining, luxury, and networking. The kind of gathering where deals worth millions were made. He drove his glossy black sedan with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could ever go wrong. Halfway there, a faint rattling came from under the hood. Richard frowned, annoyed but unconcerned. His car was brand new, top of the line, built for perfection. But the sound grew louder, sharper. Moments later, smoke hissed upward and warning lights lit the dashboard. He swore, pulling the car to the shoulder of the empty highway. Stepping out, he loosened his tie, the hot sun pressing against his back. He pulled out his phone, but the screen showed barely a flicker of service. Out here, miles from any town, he was stranded. His expensive car, his wealth, his connections, none of it could save him now. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. An hour dragged by, then another. Not a single car slowed to help. Sweat stained his collar as he paced, cursing his luck. Then in the distance a figure appeared, walking steadily down the road, carrying a small toolbox in one hand. Richard narrowed his eyes. As the man came closer, recognition hit him like a stone. The mechanic from the storm, the one he had mocked. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his face calm, unreadable. He looked at the smoke curling from the hood, then back at Richard. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Need a hand." Pride clawed at Richard's throat. He considered refusing, pretending he didn't need help. But the truth was plain. He was stranded, and this man was his only chance. With a stiff nod, Richard stepped aside. Daniel set his toolbox down and went to work, his hands steady, his motions practiced. He explained as he worked, though Richard barely listened, too caught up in the humiliation. The problem was a snapped belt, simple yet crippling. Within half an hour, the engine purred back to life. When Daniel stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, Richard reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick wad of bills. He held it out quickly, avoiding eye contact. "Take it, for your trouble." Daniel shook his head. "Keep it, kindness is free, but so is karma." He closed his toolbox, gave a small nod and walked away, leaving Richard speechless by the side of the road. For the first time in decades, Richard felt smaller than his pride, smaller than his wealth. The encounter gnawed at Richard for days. Richard had always believed strength came from power, from proving himself above others. But Daniel's quiet dignity had unsettled him in ways money never could. Why had he helped? Why had he refused payment? Why had he spoken as if kindness held more weight than gold? One sleepless night, Richard drove back to the small garage. He found Daniel tightening bolts beneath an old pickup truck. Daniel looked up, surprised, but didn't speak. Richard swallowed his pride. "I came to apologize. That night in the rain, I was cruel. You didn't deserve that." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all make mistakes. The important part is what we do after." It was not dramatic forgiveness. It was simple, honest, and heavier than any lecture. Richard felt a shift in his chest, something long buried stirring awake. He began returning to the garage now and then. At first it was awkward, an executive in a crisp suit standing among oil-stained rags and clinking tools. But gradually, walls began to fall. He learned about Daniel's wife, who had died years earlier, leaving him to raise Maria alone. He learned about Maria's dreams of studying medicine, of making a life beyond the garage. He learned that every long night, every walk home, every sacrifice was for her. Richard saw wealth in a way he had never understood. Wealth was not the car he drove or the suit he wore. It was the love Daniel carried, the resilience that kept him standing, the pride in his daughter's eyes when she spoke of her future. When Maria applied to college, Richard quietly pulled strings to help. He didn't tell Daniel, didn't seek thanks. He wanted for once to give without expecting anything in return. Maria received a scholarship that eased the burden, and Daniel's eyes shone with relief when he told Richard the news, unaware of the silent hand that had guided it. The months turned into years. Richard's ruthless reputation softened. He began investing not only in business but in people. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for community programs, donations that carried no press releases. His colleagues noticed the change, though few understood it. At his retirement gathering years later, Richard was no longer the man who measured life in money and power. When asked what had inspired him to change, he told the story of a rainy night, of arrogance, of karma, and of a mechanic who fixed more than just his car. "Kindness is free," Richard said, repeating the words that had stayed with him all these years. "But so is karma. If you live with arrogance, it will return to you. If you live with compassion, that too will find its way back." In the crowd that day, Daniel stood quietly, his hands folded, pride shining not in Richard's success, but in the truth that one small act of kindness had rippled outward farther than either of them could have imagined. Maria, now a young doctor, stood beside him, her smile a reflection of the life her father had fought for. And though the world rarely notices men who walk home in the rain, Daniel knew that night had proved a simple truth. No act of kindness is ever wasted, and no cruelty escapes the hand of karma.